is basically just to explain what's termed the public benefit requirement. So RSA 149M, the statute, the Solid Waste Act in New Hampshire, requires that any time DES reviews a permit application for a solid waste facility, particularly a landfill, it must determine, in order to approve that application, that the proposed solid waste facility provides a substantial public benefit. And that public benefit is defined in the statute as basically meeting three criteria. And in order to find that there is a public benefit, that the facility provides a public benefit, the agency must find that all three of those criteria are satisfied. And in short, I'm paraphrasing a bit here, the first one is the short and long-term, that we have to consider these criteria. The first one is the short and long-term need for a facility of the proposed type, size, and location to provide capacity to accommodate solid waste generated within the state. The second one is the ability of the proposed facility to assist the state in achieving the implementation of the hierarchy and goals, and that's the hierarchies provided for, and this is identified in the statute, and goals both in the statute but also in any solid waste plans that the agency may prepare or that are submitted by districts to the agency. And then the third one is the ability of the proposed facility to assist in achieving the goals of the state solid waste management plan and one or more solid waste plans. And I apologize, I kind of covered that in the earlier one. But basically, so those are the three criteria that an applicant for a new landfill or an expansion of landfill needs to make a showing in their application that they meet those three criteria. And the agency must review that and make that determination and concur that the facility meets those criteria in order to show that the facility would provide a substantial public benefit. But the agency has a very clearly defined role, and that is that we are the permitting authority for solid waste facilities. And in fact, the statute directly says that DES shall administer the solid waste management program through a permit system. So anybody is eligible to apply for a permit for a facility, and our job is really very clinical. We look at that and we review it against all of the criteria in the law and in the rules, and we make a determination about whether that facility application can meet all of those requirements.
So if I may interrupt real quick, I know that Representative Bixby brought up capacity too. So that goes into the capacity situation where if we're not recycling, it's going into our landfills, and our landfills are getting full. And what is our capacity situation at this point?
So with regard to capacity, so we have three major commercial landfills currently operating in New Hampshire. There are a few municipal landfills that do some commercial operation, but they're limited service areas. So I'm not going to talk about those. I'll just, the relevance to the statewide system is really these three landfills. The biggest one Senator Gray made reference to, and that's the Turnkey Landfill in Rochester, operated by Waste Management Incorporated. That one currently has a permit that was recently, within the last couple of years, was approved for an expansion, and that will operate through, is expected and required to operate through 2034. The second, and I would note, just, this is not passing judgment on this by any means, but I think it's relevant to your question. That facility is expected to have some additional land where it could propose to expand in the future, but that's not something that is currently, that's nothing that's before the department at this time. The second one is the Mount Carberry landfill in Success, New Hampshire, which is a small town adjacent to Berlin. And that is operated by the Androscoggin Valley Regional Refuse Disposal District. And that is, although it's owned by a quasi-public, or really a public entity, it is also operated commercially. So it does take trash from an unlimited service area. It is currently permitted to operate through 2025, and I believe has an application before us, or one that may be expected that would expand it. So that also is a facility that has land that could be looked at for expansions in the future. And then the third one is the North Country Environmental Services landfill in Bethlehem. That one is currently permitted to operate through 2026. It does have land adjacent to it that theoretically could be used to expand it. However, I believe a zoning change would be required in that case in order for it to to be able to expand.
So the people that are watching this hearing right now, it was news to me. Hello? The people that are watching this hearing right now, it was news to me in one of the previous hearings to find out that Massachusetts and other states actually bring in their garbage into New Hampshire. Is that true?
That's absolutely correct. Yes.
And so do we do the same? Do we send our trash down to them?
To a much lesser degree. So basically the issue that's important to understand with respect to solid waste disposal is that it's considered subject to the Interstate Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So the agency or the state can't enact something that unfairly discriminates against interstate commerce of solid waste or importation of trash to New Hampshire. So while any facility that seeks a permit in New Hampshire does have to demonstrate that it will provide a public benefit to the people of the state by providing, in part by providing capacity for the state's waste, that doesn't preclude a facility from also seeking to operate at a much greater quantity or throughput, thereby allowing out-of-state waste importation. So the turnkey landfill example, last year I think it was around 50-50, where about 50% of the waste landfill there was imported from out of state. I believe the NCES landfill was on the order of 25% last year. And then Mount Carberry, I'm not going to quote, it was in that range, but I remember, so I'm not going to give you the number.
So if the landfills up north run out of capacity in the next 5 or 10 years or so, what do they do with their garbage?
Well, so I guess the best way to answer that question is that if we assume as an assumption that no landfills get cited and we fill up the landfills and there's no landfills in the state, as an argument's sake, and I'm not saying we're at risk of that, but let's say that happened. What a lot of states are doing, who have taken a much more aggressive stance on development of landfills, is they are shipping their waste out of state. So there are a number of states, including New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, where very large landfills have been constructed, and there are, in southern New England or even, in the Northeast, states like New York and Connecticut are actually not only trucking trash to those out-of-state landfills, but they're actually sending it by a train.
Wow. So we could beef up our recycling in the state if we wanted to reduce our landfill intake, I would assume.
It's clear from the statute that there's a desire on the part of the legislature to maximize diversion from landfilling or any other and disposal and maximize recycling as much as possible. That is in large part right now, market-based because of these problems we're having with the cost of processing recyclables. But certainly making recycling easier and less expensive will almost certainly have reduced the amount of waste from New Hampshire that is disposed of in our landfills.
Representative Timothy Egan mentioned that it's a $5.5 billion industry, talking about tourism. Has there been an economic impact as how it will affect tourism if this landfill or if landfills are made? I mean, has there been a study saying that this will impact our economic benefit from our wildlife? Or do you deal with that? I'm
sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, I'm going to try that again. Representative Egan brought up the fact that the tourism in New Hampshire is about $5.5 billion. By adding another landfill, will that or allow a couple more landfills to be built? Do you think that'll have an impact on our tourism?
Really don't know. I'm not aware of any study that's looked at that, and I really don't know the answer to that.
So we could beef up our recycling in the state if we wanted to reduce our landfill intake, I would assume.
It's clear from the statute that there's a desire on the part of the legislature to maximize diversion from landfilling or any other and disposal and maximize recycling as much as possible. That is in large part right now, market-based because of these problems we're having with the cost of processing recyclables. But certainly making recycling easier and less expensive will almost certainly have reduced the amount of waste from New Hampshire that is disposed of in our landfills.
Representative Timothy Egan mentioned that it's a $5.5 billion industry, talking about tourism. Has there been an economic impact as how it will affect tourism if this landfill, or if landfills are made? I mean, has there been a study saying that this will impact our economic benefit from our wildlife? Or do you deal with that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, I'm going to try that again. Representative Egan brought up the fact that the tourism in New Hampshire is about $5.5 billion. By adding another landfill, will that, or allow a couple more landfills to be built, do you think that'll have an impact on our tourism?
Really don't know. I'm not aware of any study that's looked at that, and I really don't know the answer to that.
Son?
Welcome, Lisa.
Lisa, you should be able to unmute yourself.
This is not Lisa Tillotson. This is Brian Gould. She's our office manager, and I guess this account is under her name.
Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Senator. So, my name is Brian Gould. I'm a lawyer with Cleveland, Waters and Bass in Concord. I've had the privilege of representing the New Hampshire subsidiaries of Casella Waste Systems for close to 30 years. A lot of my testimony, because I'm coming here at the end, has already been addressed, and I'm mindful that you don't want me to plow the same ground. So I'm going to just try to touch on a couple of things quickly. First of all, we've heard how this is just a simple concept that even sixth graders can understand it and so forth. But as a Senate committee, I know you're aware that life is much more complicated than, simple desires. And one of the things that has to be weighed in all of this is there in fact a waste disposal crisis? We have just had to do an analysis of that in connection with the Granite State landfill application. The DES is forecasting that there are going to be 40 million tons of trash, over 40 million tons of trash generated in the state over the next 20 years. It assumes a 25% recycling rate, meaning that over 30 million tons will require disposal. Right now, New Hampshire has, it depends on how you measure it, but it has between 7.5 million and 21.5 million tons of waste disposal capacity over that same 20-year period. So even if you assume that all waste in New Hampshire is going to all the waste disposal facilities in New Hampshire, and those facilities aren't taking waste from anywhere else, that's a shortfall of 9 million to 23 million tons over the 20-year period. But as a couple of people have alluded to, over 1 million tons per year of non-New Hampshire waste is sent to New Hampshire disposal facilities. About 80% of it goes to the turnkey facility in Senator Gray's district. The shortfall, therefore, would increase over 20 million tons over that 20-year period. So one of the things you have to take into account is, are we going to be running out of waste capacity? The other thing to keep in mind, and I asked you to investigate.
Sorry to interrupt, Senator Avard, that's 2.5 minutes.
All right. Brian, can you wrap it up in 20,
yeah.
30 seconds?
Aside from that, I also want to address this constitutionality argument. Although property rights have not been afforded a great deal of protection under court decisions, you still have to have a rational basis for any distinction drawn in statute. A setback of 100 feet between the landfill and adjoining property and 500 feet between the landfill and any property that has a residence on it or that is zoned residential is in the rules right now. If this bill is passed, it would be permissible to site a new landfill 500 feet from a residential neighborhood and 200 feet from any lake, but not to site it within 2 miles of a state park where no one lives and only visitors are present. I ask you to consider whether that provides whether that is a rational distinction that this bill would create in New Hampshire law. Thank you for your time.
Questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much, Brian. I just have one question with regards to Brian Gold said something to the effect that we do have a crisis on our hands and that has to do with capacity. Is that hyperbole or is that real?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So this is an area where for many, many years, you know, you can, and I think one of your other folks who testified made an important note, and that is when we talk about capacity, and in fact, the capacity analysis that the agency has to do when it reviews a landfill permit application, we only look at currently permitted capacity. That means capacity at operating landfills that currently has approval to operate. So those timelines that I gave you in my prior testimony about how long those landfills could operate is based on what they're currently permitted. And to be clear, when we permit a facility, we not only, you know, we expect the public benefit determination is in many cases predicated on a certain service life for the facility. So when I said that the turnkey landfill was expected to operate until 2034, it's not just us saying, yeah, we think they'll last that long. Under the terms of their permit, they are to provide capacity for the people of the state until 2034. And you can say the same for any of these other approvals of capacity. So I'm a little roundabout to answer your question, but I had to lay that out there because in essence, you know, if you describe a crisis, it assumes that, well, you need X amount of something and you only have Y. But the reality is that we haven't made all the permit decisions that we will make for the next 20 years. So, you know, in the case of the turnkey landfill, it has a current permit through 2034. That is only, you know, 13 years out. And the other two facilities that currently have permits that are for 3 to 4 years or 5 years. That doesn't mean that we won't receive and act on permit applications to expand capacity. So I, as the director of the Waste Division, have always been loath to describe a capacity crisis because I think you have to understand it in the context of how we can talk about capacity. It's not appropriate for me as a representative of the agency and a permitting authority to prejudge or anticipate a certain amount of capacity. Our job is to react to proposed applications for facilities and act on them accordingly. So when we talk about capacity, it's only appropriate for us to talk about currently permitted capacity.
So Senate E&NR Springfield, that testimony from Scott Hazelton, he was talking about capacity and if, I don't know, is it Bethlehem? Is that the one that could be closing in 5 years? If that's the case.
Reference that they used the NCES facility in Bethlehem.
Okay. So if that's the case, then they will have in themselves a crisis, a financial one at least, having to ship it to either turnkey or out of state. And it varies from 75,000 additional to 30 million. That to me is a crisis. But my question to you is, what is the time frame to develop a permit process in the first place? How long does it take for that to happen? And what is the cost to the people who are going to run it?
I'm sorry, could you
the timeline to have a permit approved?
Well, for a brand new landfill that is sited on a greenfield, in other words, it's not an expansion of existing facility, there's a substantial period of time that certainly I'm sure these applicants would tell you they spend a lot of time preparing to submit an application. And
years? Is it years?
In total, sure. I think that's an accurate statement. Right? I think it's probably 3 to 4 years to from conception to getting a decision, or it could be a little less, could be a little longer. Depends on the circumstances of the particular facility.
And local opposition and could interrupt that as well, depending upon not my backyard. Yeah, interesting. All right.